Before we get into how you pulled all this off from Rochester, I want to get to a special part in your career where you got to tour with Ringo Starr.
Well, it was a fluke. I had done a story on this thing called the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp, which was the same guy who did the baseball fantasy camps, a guy named David Fishoff. And he was a strange guy. He went to London or New York, and he went to Ringo. None of the Beatles had toured after they broke up, except for McCartney had done a little bit in the 70s. But George Harrison and Ringo hadn't done any touring. Of course, Lennon was gone by this point. So he went to Ringo and said, would you like to do a tour? And Ringo said, God, I'd love to do a tour. So they came up with this concept that, he would do his 5 or 6 Beatle hits, and then everybody else in the band would be famous, and they would each do their couple of hits, and you'd have a whole evening of hit music. So they had done a few of these tours, and when the tour came about for 2001, he came to me and he said, could you help me put the band together? And what ended up happening is I went to him and I said, well, I represent Greg Lake from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And that was always a tough spot to fill, a bass player who could sing hit songs. There's not a lot of them out there. There's Sting, there's Paul McCartney, there's Geddy Lee from Rush. None of those guys were going to do the tour. And Greg Lake had been the singer in ELP, and he was a bass player. So, and he had Lucky Man, he had all these great songs. And he was also in King Crimson. So he got the gig right away. And then David had asked him, could you help me find more people? So I brought in a guy named Ian Hunter from Mount the Hoople. And I had made the suggestion that they should get a woman in the band and they should get Sheila E. And of course, Ringo hadn't even thought of putting a woman in the band, but she ended up being a big hit. She came out and did her couple of hits, and when Ringo would come up front to sing, she would play the drums. So then what ended up happening is, because of my experience with the media and everything, Ringo's people asked me to get involved, and I actually worked on the tour, which was probably the highlight of my career. And the one interesting note is I got a phone call one night. I was at about half the shows, the other half I came home. And I get a phone call one night, and they're on the tarmac in Ringo's private jet, and Greg Lake says, Ringo wants to talk to you. And he hands the phone to Ringo, and Ringo says, I hear you've got a connection to Apple Computers. I said, yeah, I know some people there. He goes, well, I want to get one of these computers because Greg tells me I can put a studio in my house and all I need is a little computer. And I said, yeah. Now you got to remember, this is like 2001, so all this stuff like Pro Tools was just getting started. And I said, well, let me call them. And he goes, I want the one that Greg's got. I said, fine, I can get you that. And he goes, and I want you to tell him it's for me, and I'm going to be doing artwork on it as well. I said, oh, okay. I said, let me make some phone calls and see what kind of price I can get it for you. He goes, well, tell him it's for Ringo, and I want it for free. And I just said, well, they're like $6,000. I don't know. I'll see what I can do, right? And he starts laughing. He goes, I'm just kidding. He goes, I'll pay for it. Don't worry about it. So it was funny, but he had a great sense of humor. Every day was a funny joke, really funny joke.
Unbelievable. And that's not your only connection to the Beatles. George Harrison, when he decided after John Lennon's death to do a few interviews, you were one of them.
That was, I was lucky. I interviewed 3 of the 4. I never got to interview John. I was probably going to get an interview with John because my career was just starting to happen when he did Double Fantasy. But anyways, I had gotten a phone call that he was coming out with an album. And I said, look, I can do it for a couple of different publications. And I had been trying to get into USA Today at that point. And I knew that if I had something big like George Harrison, I could probably get in with that. So what ended up happening is I pitched it for a couple of different publications, different stories out of one interview. And they liked that because it's very economical. And it turns out that he had read my stuff in a magazine called Mix, which is a recording studio trade publication. And he had a big studio in his house, and he used to read my stuff. And she goes, George definitely wants to talk to you. I said, well, that's great. And I ended up flying to LA, and we did it at Warner Brothers. And I'll never forget, I was so nervous because it was the first time I had ever met a Beatle. This was before the Ringo thing. And I walk in the room, and I sit down, and they bring in George. And I said, George, I just have to tell you, I'm from the East Coast, and I said, I've been up since 4 in the morning just trying to think, what am I going to say to you, and how am I going to make this interview interesting? And he looked at me, and I was the first interview of about 5 that he was doing. And he looked at me and he said, He goes, I've been up at 4 in the morning too, figuring out what I'm going to say. So it was just, we just kind of laughed at that point. That broke the ice, and it was great. We had a wonderful talk. It was about 45 minutes, just me and him.
You went to Syracuse University. You went into this as a journalist. How did you transition from journalism to management?
Everything was gradual. When I got into journalism, I was originally going to go to New York and LA, but I realized that none of the big tours would ever open in New York City. So I said, gee, this is a pretty good place to be based out of because I can cover Buffalo, Syracuse, Albany. I could go to Toronto. It's all pretty close. And usually the tours would play those cities before they hit Madison Square Garden. So all through the 80s, things really blew up for me because Fleetwood Mac, Hall & Oates, Peter Gabriel, all these guys, they would be in Buffalo, Rochester, or Syracuse before they hit New York. And that really helped my career. That put me in touch with a lot of labels. And then in 1985, Sony came out with the compact disc. And that changed everything because now all these albums had to be reissued. They needed new artwork. They wanted to do these expanded collections, the 4 CD box set. And they needed guys to help pick out the tracks, write the liner notes. And I happened to have a huge archive of interviews and press materials, photos. And I got known as this guy that could write this stuff and put these box sets. And I did about 50 of them. I worked on Cher, James Brown, the Village People. I worked on groups like Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Deep Purple and Foreigner. I just worked on a ton of these collections. And some of the groups I had a long involvement with, the most prominent being Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And they came to me and said, well, we got a manager who's British, but we really need somebody here in America. And I started managing Greg Lake, and then eventually I would work with ELP when they were working together and do his solo stuff when he was on his own. And then eventually I worked with Palmer, who I'm still with. Been with those guys since '92.
So when you would manage bands and go on tours, it's something of a feat to do it from Rochester.
Yeah, it was difficult. I mean, when I first got out of college, I was working in advertising because I needed to make a certain amount of money, obviously. But I had a certain amount of flexibility, and I could always get away for, a week at a time. And then as my career in the music end of it started getting more and more advanced, I started needing bigger chunks of time to go to Japan and to go to China and go to places like that. So eventually I just, I made the break maybe 15 or 16 years ago, and I just work exclusively in the music business. But being in Rochester, the internet has helped tremendously. I had a Skype call today to London, and there were a bunch of people in the room, and it saved me the hassle of having to fly over there for a meeting. I now manage about 5 bands, all from the classic rock era, all who have had platinum records, and these things just fall into my lap. I'm working on a new project now with a guitar player named Jeff Beck, who's very famous. He had been playing in a group called Beck, Bogert, and Appice, and I managed Bogert and Appice because they were in the Vanilla Fudge. And I found out that Appice, the drummer, Carmine, had these unreleased tapes of when he played with Jeff Beck. And I said, what are you doing with them? He goes, I don't know, they're in my storage thing. I said, well, get them out. So it turns out that we cleaned the tapes up, had them remastered, fixed some mistakes that were in there, and it's a double album of unreleased material. And Jeff Beck loved it. I met with him when he was in Buffalo, and looks like it's coming out on Sony later in the year. So these things just come about.
So your dad worked at the War Memorial. He used to get you backstage to see stuff as a kid. You've been in the industry this long. Does music still hold that magic for you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is, as far as my interests in life outside of my family and things like that, it is the biggest thing in my life and will continue to be the biggest thing. There's nothing that moves me emotionally and like music. And I have to tell you that, I grew up in the 60s. I was born in 1956. We didn't have, video games. We didn't have youth movies. I mean, if you went to a movie, you saw a James Bond movie. That was about it. And then the Beatles would come out with Help or something occasionally. There wasn't a lot of youth-oriented product out there. We had one thing. We had music. That was it. And music drove a lot of stuff when I was growing up. I mean, the Vietnam War was driven by young people who were motivated by these protest songs that came out on the radio. And then we were there as the industry grew from kind of a cottage industry, which had started in the beginning with Elvis and Little Richard and everything. You know, Elvis in the beginning never played places bigger than like 2,000 seats. And then, of course, the Beatles played Shea Stadium. Right. And that ushered in corporate involvement and the stadium tours. And it's been very exciting. And I had this magical childhood because my dad was on the board of directors for the War Memorial. And he would take me to see the Yardbirds with Jimmy Page on guitar. And you know, we went and saw this up-and-coming guitar player named Jimi Hendrix, and I got my picture taken with him, and I met Led Zeppelin, and, you know, it was like that movie Almost Famous. And, of course, that's when I realized, okay, you know, and I played a couple instruments. I was in a few bands, but I said, no, I like the behind-the-scenes thing better. I like working either as a journalist or a manager or, you know, promoting, things like that. Those are the guys that have long, long careers in this business.
Yeah, I love that. What else do you want to add that I might have missed? We're going to talk about I'll ask you about the Grammys in a second, but I want to get a two-shot for that question.
I just think it's, the only thing I might add is that I kind of take it upon myself that I think it's important to educate this generation of music fans on what came before. You know, I teach at Nazareth and I teach at the University of Rochester, which owns Eastman School of Music. And because of my travel, I can only teach one day a week, but I love the teaching. And I'll go through these incredible stories of, you know, how Brian Epstein engineered 3 weeks in a row on the Ed Sullivan Show and how they made that transition from playing, you know, a 2,000-seater when they first came over here to playing Shea Stadium within a year. And selling it out in 20 minutes, I might add. And it really was, I mean, there were all these revolutions that went on at the same time in the 60s. There was the sexual revolution, there was the, you know, the music revolution, there was the fashion revolution, politics changed, everything changed in the 60s. That was the decade. And I have to say, the fact that I got to live through it, fantastic.
And get a backstage pass to it in a way.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, that is cool. So you went to the Grammys this year. You've been several other times. You went to the Clive Davis party. How was it?
It's great. I became a voting member in 1989 or 1990, and I can tell you I have not missed a single Grammy since 1990. And, you know, as a journalist, I've gone and I've covered it, and then, you know, I'm kind of involved in the Academy as well. And I get into all the events. I mean, the Clive Davis party, which is the night before, is the hot ticket. And it's basically just a big thank you to everybody in the business. They pay for everything, the meals and everything. And all the big stars that are on the Grammys the next night, they all perform there. Brandi Carlile performed, and this new sensation, her name is Her. She's a singer-songwriter, guitar player. They performed, and usually somebody like Earth, Wind & Fire will be up there, and it's just it's a phenomenal thing. It's a very tough ticket. I used to get into it, then I couldn't get into it for many years, and now I'm kind of back on the good list, and I still get into it. But there's also an event called Musicares where we raise money for music-related causes. For instance, musicians that don't have health insurance, they get cancer, we help underwrite it. Musicians with addiction issues, we underwrite that. When Katrina hit, we bought all the New Orleans musicians new instruments because they lost most of them in the flood. We've given away, I think it's $52 million. And, you know, it's an expensive dinner to attend, but I go every year because it's a cause I believe in. And, you know, they honor a different celebrity. One year it was McCartney, one year it was Springsteen, one year it was Neil Young. And all famous people sing their songs, and then they usually get up at the end. So it's a great event. And then they have a few other ones. There's another thing I've been involved with called the Law Initiative. And I went and met with Louise Slaughter just before she passed away and lobbied for this thing called the Music Modernization Act, which is really changing the whole pay structure. Because let's face it, artists are not making the money off record sales anymore. That's kind of gone. So it's all about streaming now, and they weren't getting paid much, and the writers and the producers and people like that weren't getting paid anything. So this legislation, which Donald Trump signed in January, has changed a lot of that. And you're going to see, like for instance, nobody who had a recording before 1972 was getting paid anything for streaming.
Wow.
And now that's changed. And that actually came about because of a lawsuit launched by the rock group The Turtles. Remember Happy Together? They said, hey, this is crazy. All our hits were before 72. And you play them all the time. How come we're not getting paid? So, you know, it's the Recording Academy does a lot of great stuff. We do a lot of charitable work, and a lot of people don't realize that. They think it's just a bunch of, you know, overblown rock stars and their managers having fun, but it's not. It's more than that.